All right, welcome everybody. Mic check, testing. All right, we have mic levels. So, welcome to everybody around the world. Welcome to all my subscribers. I have a very good video here today. It's spent the vast majority of my life trying to solve this last part of Daniel's prophecy, which was the 2300 days or 2300 years from Daniel chapter 8. So, nonetheless, it took me 15 years alone to crack the chapter 12 prophecy in chapters, which is linked to chapter 7, which I cover in my book. And but the one that I always left to the side because it didn't appear to be pertaining to the end days itself was the 2300 years. So it was very perplexing. I could never solve it. So that was the last one, the last puzzle for me to solve. And in the last few days, I believe I have solved it. So I'll say right off the bat, the numbers aren't exact, but once you hear the evidence and the historical events that took place, it's within, 29 years. And when you're talking about vast periods of time, like 23, well, it's actually 1150, 1,150 years. 29 years isn't, that bad of an overlap. But once you hear about the historical events that took place, I mean, I think it's pretty much undeniable. So I'm like 95 to 97% confident that this is the solution for the puzzle. So very quickly, let me go. Actually, no, I won't get up. My books are available on Amazon, so I won't bother getting up to show the book. But I've got plenty of videos on my channel where you can see the book and this and that there, and even hear some chapters from it. Excuse me. Still recovering from an illness I had about 2 weeks ago. So in Daniel chapter 8, now this could be a very long video, but I really don't want it to be. It's linked to a lot of other studies that I was doing recently on different topics related to the Daniel chapter 12 prophecy and everything to do with the Temple Mount and everything. But anyways, keeping things simple for this video. In chapter 8 is where we hear about the 2300 day years. Again, keep things simple and quick. I apply the year principle for logical reasons. Number one, if you take it as days, it doesn't fit with anything. And it's illogical that God would give such a vast number, such a high number, and then the unit value for it be something literal. That would make it so uber specific. Excuse me, it just makes it a little bit unrealistic. Like in the other examples, 1260, 1290, 1335, and then we got 2300. If these are all to be taken as days, it's just a little bit unrealistic. Okay, it's too overly specific to say that God was telling us that it would stop on the 5th day out of a week, arbitrarily at some point, like from day 5 in example of 1335. So on that one logical note alone, it would make more sense if it was years. Secondly, a lot of these events are talking about the time of exile after Rome caused Israel's fall. Then we know the exile has been near 2,000 years. So it's illogical to say that, oh, God was just talking. And like, for example, Revelation 12 is another place where it talks about 1,260 days. And I talk about it in my book. I have chapters devoted to this, explaining it, right? But it's not days, it's years. Israel didn't go into exile for 3.5 years, okay? It's not talking about King Antiochus. Like these different things in Daniel's prophecies are not talking about him at all. If I remember, I'll make some points on that note as well. I mean, I'll say this quickly. Almost every one of the rulers from different kingdoms over time defiled the temple, put statues up in it. They all did it. Like everybody did it. So I'll just say that now before I forget. But it's not Antiochus, right? So it's the day year principle we see from Ezekiel 4, like I've said a million times. In Ezekiel 4, God gives Daniel a prophecy where he gives a number value and then days. It's like 380 or 390 days. But God tells Ezekiel verbatim that it's day for a year, day for a year. He repeats it. So it's day for year. So God tells us and told us that he uses day for a year principle like that. And therefore, you are to understand that when God gives you prophecies regarding time periods where he gives you the number value, the units of time aren't to be taken literally. Another example of this, where I can show that I'm right in my reasoning, is in, what was it, Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years under Babylon. Well, Daniel, in the book of Daniel, it says Daniel was there thinking about Jeremiah's 7-year prophecy. The angel came to him and said, "Oh, Daniel, it's not 70 years, it's 490 years, right? Because it's 70 weeks of years." So again, another example where God has given a worded prophecy containing a number for the period of time, like how long it is, and the units of time are not to be taken literally. Okay, so and God tells us there's only a few prophecies in the Bible where God gives us periods of time where he gives us the number, like how long it will be. There's only a few. In my book, I cover 7 of these, the ones that pertain to the end times. There's not many others in the Bible, so there's not many altogether to start with. Okay, and out of those 7 in my book, 1 or 2 are, one of them's not in the Bible. It's from First Enoch, but it backs up the 2024 timeline and all of that. And it fits into the rebirth of Israel in 1948. So I decided I would be foolish to not include that in the book. But anyways, right? So what it comes down to is in Daniel chapter 8, we have one of the examples where it talks about a horn, a figure, a king who does all this big bad stuff. Now, Christians typically think this to be the Antichrist. I'm not going to get into that because it'll make this video like an hour long. It is not the Antichrist. It's one of the Herods. Okay, and I'll prove this because if you read what the chapter says about that specific king, what he does could only have been done by one of the 2 Herods. Okay, it's probably the second Herod at the time of Jesus' death. But in a sense, it could also be the first Herod because the first Herod tried to get Jesus killed. He got all the firstborn Hebrews, was it, or Israelites put to death, firstborn males, in an attempt to destroy Jesus, the Messiah. Okay, because he had heard this knowledge from the wise men that, like Holy Spirit, divine spiritual knowledge that the Messiah had been born or would be born somewhere. So it could be him, but I think it's the second Herod. But in all fairness, it could actually just represent the Herods because that was the Hasmonean dynasty, and they were both Herods. And it could just be the horn could just be representing both of them. But nonetheless, it's probably the second one because everything pertains to the death of Jesus. But they also did try to kill him when he was born, right? Can't deny that. So that's who this is actually talking about. I'll read all the verses. I got everything up here. I'll just give a quick synopsis for everybody up front because some people think I talk too long in the videos. And anyways, sometimes it's better for me to give a quick synopsis up front as well to help my train of thought. So that's who this one is talking about in Daniel chapter 8. So in Daniel chapter 8, sorry, I'm adjusting my sweater. In Daniel chapter 8 is talking about the Herods, okay, who would oppose Jesus, oppose the Prince of Princes and all of that, and, and all that, right? I'll read the verses in a second. But then it also talks about one of the key important terms pertaining to the removal of the sacrifice. Okay, now this is an important term. I was doing other studies on the last few days. Again, that other topic, to start talking about that would take an additional hour or so. Sorry, I thought I saw something at the door. But it gets into the removal of the continual sacrifice. Now, this is important because in Daniel chapter 9, which is talking about the same time period, the Herodian kings, the death of Jesus, okay, but everybody openly accepts that Daniel chapter, every Christian does, accepts chapter 9 is talking about the death of Jesus. And obviously the Roman invasion, not invasion because they already ruled, but invasion of and destruction of the temple. Okay, so every Christian accepts that about chapter 9, but lots of Christians have their own theories on chapter 8. But when I read it, you will understand it's definitely the Herods who opposed Jesus and got him put to death. It's the same event and everything being talked about in chapter 9. Okay, and I'll show that because it's got the same words, verses, and everything. It's got to be the same one. Okay, and it also mentions the removal of the sacrifice again. Okay, so that would help it connect, and it's talking about the same one thing. Now, after this, what we can see, what I'll read is from chapter 11, where it's talking about the final beast kingdom. Okay, because that it'll triangulate over and connect to something else. Because what I learned in learning some extra history, that's what's helped me with learning how to solve Daniel over my lifetime, is learning parts of history that I just was never taught in school and was not even aware even existed. One was the history of the creation and the establishment of the Empire of Islam and so forth, and how it's the final beast kingdom. I didn't even know about the history of that. And I had no clue, but once I learned it and what they did and the dates that things happened on, and I saw that it fit with Daniel's prophecies, that that was my solution. After 15 years not being able to solve Daniel, back from like 18 to whatever age it was, I couldn't solve it. It used to frustrate the heck out of me. But only when I learned that history that I had never been taught, was never aware of, did I see the connections and how it perfectly fits, right? So, in like fashion here, there was another part of history that I didn't know about too well, and that was the period of time after Grecia fell until Islam rose up and conquered in 640 AD. Now, this is almost 900 years. We know that Rome was ruling, so then they ruled for a good portion of it. But for example, after Grecia fell and split into the four kingdoms, most Christians, the average person, even as nerdy as I am with everything, I never bothered to care to research what those four were. They're not as significant as Grecia itself, yes, but the average person doesn't know what they were. But in the research I've learned, and not my own opinions like theories and stuff, but looking at what all the solid, proper opinions are from the scholars, and then, fact checking it just in case, the history, and it does look quite right. It says it splits into four according to the four winds or something like that when Grecia falls, right? And the fall of Grecia is talked about in 3 different chapters of Daniel. He devotes 3 different chapters talking about the rise of Alexander. Alexander falls, and his kingdom is split into 4. Okay, and Daniel also clearly, distinctly talks about a 4th and final beast kingdom that will come up after Grecia. Okay, so Daniel talks about in 3 chapters the rise and fall of Grecia and how Grecia split, because King Alexander only ruled for a very short time. He represented Grecia in that sense. When he fell is when it split into the 4. So it's not like, the other kingdoms where they may have ruled for longer. It was like a short period of time with Alexander, and then it immediately fell into the 4 sub empires, right? But they all had to be under Greek. But what they were was the Seleucid Empire, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which was northern, and it does identify one of these kingdoms as being northern. It identifies another as being southern. This is openly accepted as being Ptolemaic Egypt. Okay, so, and I know briefly offhand that in Egypt there were some of the queens who were in cahoots with these other rulers, and they married them. And when you read Daniel's few verses about that period of time, it talks about a queen of the south or whatever, and they intermarry and whatever it is that he says. But most importantly, right, it doesn't talk about the west or the east and who they are. But what we can see from history and what the scholars say is probably the Seleucids, because they were a major ruling force after Alexander. Was it? Yeah, Alexander fell. Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt. Who are the other two? Well, we got Roman. I've always believed, based on the scriptures, that Rome wasn't the final beast kingdom. It cannot be. It's impossible for a lot of reasons. Again, I'm going to spare a half-hour discussion on that. But it wasn't Rome, and it had to be Islam. It just has to be. I mean, Islam had the biggest empire in all history. They still rule vast portions of the world today from that empire. They ruled over Israel for over 1,260 years. They built the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. They rewrote the Bible with their own text. I mean, there's just too much to even get into on that note there. The Roman Empire died out a few hundred years AD. You know what I mean? But I'm not getting into that side argument. But it wasn't Rome. But the thing is, Rome was essentially the same race of peoples as the Greeks. You couldn't say this about the Medes and Persians and the Babylonians and the Greeks. They're all different, right? Daniel didn't specify who the fourth beast kingdom would be in terms of a peoples, but he did say in 3 different places that the 4th and final beast kingdom is different from all the other beast kingdoms, and that it's different from all other kingdoms on the earth, and that the 4th beast kingdom will have the largest kingdom. I'm pretty sure he does say the largest. It will be the greatest. If he doesn't say largest, it's greatest empire, and it will tread everything down, right? So it would be foolish of Daniel, and it would make him look like a false prophet if Daniel just predicted Rome and then did not talk about Islam, because Rome rose and fell. Islam ruled for a lot longer than Rome did. It had an empire about 10 times the size. Rome never rewrote the Bible. Rome didn't take over and, take over the religion. And, well, you could say that about Catholicism, but Catholicism was based on Jesus's Christianity, right? But Islam did all of that. So for Daniel to talk about Rome as the final beast kingdom and to ignore everything that came afterwards for like over 1,300 years would be kind of ignorant on Daniel and God's behalf, right? And Daniel says specifically that this final beast kingdom will take you to the end of the days. Rome is gone. And that's why a lot of Christians, because for whatever reason, maybe they don't get educated on the Middle Eastern history in school. I didn't really. I think most people in the Western world probably don't. So we don't know about all these things in history and the dates and this and that there. And even if they're biblical history, I don't even think they teach them in churches, right? But at the end of the day, it's just when you look at history, even innocently, with a neutral perspective, you can clearly see that Islam and its relationship with everything here occupied a huge portion of time in history, and it could be completely ignorant for Daniel to overlook it. And that's why Christians have come up with conspiracy theories saying that Rome was secretly reborn as this and that. They have every theory under the sun. It's either the British Empire or the Vatican and all sorts of things, right? Excuse me. Or they say that it's secret orders and this and that. But I'm not entertaining those things. I used to think about those things when I was younger, but I grew out of that. So anyways, it's not Rome. It's not some secret thing that of rebirth of Rome. It's nothing to do with that. Rome is dead and gone. What it is I've already said who the fourth and final beast kingdom was. And where was I going with this? So I mentioned how Daniel chapter 9 is talking about, so when Messiah died at the hand of the Herods, and the continual sacrifice, it says, is taken away. It's in the midst of the week after Jesus died. So it would have been like three and a half years after Jesus died, which would put it at 29 AD. So in 29 AD, the continual sacrifice would have been taken away. And then it says in Daniel chapter 8 that you're going to have the 2300 mornings. Now, I have a Bible that I use, like my bathroom Bible that just stays in there, and I read it whenever I go in the bathroom. Like most people have books in the bathroom. I have a Bible. In that Bible, it's not my go-to Bible translation. I always use the original translation, but I always just use it for reading and for quick reference, right? And I'll go fact check something if I need to. But in there, in the footnote on the side for this chapter of Daniel chapter 8, it openly says that it's talking about 1150, not 2300, because it's meant to be interpreted as days and mornings. That's just the cryptic way of saying, oh, it's actually, you're supposed to divide that by 2 because it's talking about one day. A day has a morning and a night in it. So when it's talking about 2300 mornings and nights or whatever it says, it's just you divide that by 2, right? So the footnote in my own Bible, one of my lesser Bibles, says that. In some of the online Bible commentaries on the major Bible sites, like Bible Gateway, Bible CC, and all that, they have the footnotes saying the same type of thing. So that's something I always personally thought you're supposed to do anyways, because it says mornings and nights or whatever, mornings and evenings. So I feel confident taking it as 1150. 2300 does not fit with anything. I spent my whole life trying to figure it out with 2300. Doesn't fit with absolutely anything. It's like trying to do algebraic formulas. I mean, it literally is. I mean, if you sit down and write down every formula, looking at every number that Daniel is given, and considering all the variables for historical events, it fills pages, and it's just like algebra. It's really, really complicated. But at the end of the day, I'm pretty certain that I've solved it here. So from when that sacrifice was taken away, 3.5 years after Jesus' death, based on what Daniel said in 29 AD, okay, we would count forward 1,150. Like I said, 2300 didn't fit with anything else. But if we go by what the verses say, we count forward that period, we should get to 1,179. Now, like I said earlier, the discovery that I made here is so perfectly fitting with the events that took place that it's the only historical fulfillment. Like outside of this, I couldn't find anything that fits, and it didn't look good because it was just like a dead end in some prophecy that Daniel gave. This prophecy is clearly about the time Jesus died. Like I said in chapter 8, it's clearly about that. So we should clearly be able to find something in history. So thankfully, I found the reasoning to take it as 1150, and doing that, it should be 1179. Now, in 1179, this was only 29 years after what I did find a match for in history. So we're only off by 29 years. So arguably, instead of 2300, the adjustment could have been made, and maybe the angel could have said 2280 or whatever it works out to, or 2270. And then, you half that and it would give you the proper number, whatever the maths work out to. So there is that argument. However, once you hear what historical stuff is taking place in this time period, like in these specific years, I don't really think there's any need to argue about this. It still falls within, you'll see what I mean in a second, right? So something I didn't know about history was that, well, I did know that the Crusaders, the Templars and all them, and whatever from it's probably Catholic, well, it was Catholic, I found out, but they came in and reconquered Jerusalem and Israel, or at least just Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, a few times in history, right, from Islam. I remember being taught that in school, but that's basically it for Middle Eastern history. But when I did some further research on that period of time, right, so like after Grecia fell, after Alexander fell, you had the Seleucids, you had Ptolemaic Egypt, you also had Rome, and then after Rome, you had Byzantine. Some count that as this Roman Byzantine, right? So it's also all one the same. And then you had the Sassanid Empire. Sassanid Empire was the final one before Islam came in and conquered. So the Sassanid Empire conquered over the Roman Byzantine Empire, and they ruled over the Holy Land at the very, very end there around 630 AD. Now, the interesting thing is that the Roman Byzantine Empire had a king called Khosrow or Khosrau, and he was usurped by his cohort or general called Shahrabaz or Shabaraz. Now, Shabaraz wasn't a king, okay? But Shabaraz ended up ruling the kingdom. Now, Shabaraz was later on at a wedding ceremony. Somebody threw a spear in the audience, and it ended up killing him, okay? Now, if we go and read Daniel chapter 11 really quick, where it talks about the fall of the Grecian beast kingdom. I have so many Bible verses open. I hope my computer doesn't freeze. So in Daniel chapter 11, right, this is what it says. In Daniel 11:3 is talking about King Alexander. A mighty king has stood, and he has ruled a great dominion and has done according to his will, right? It's talking about the kingdom of Javan, Grecia. It identifies it, right? Then it talks about his kingdom being broken according to the four winds of the heavens. That's verse 4, right? And then over the next 10 verses or so, it's talking about those little four sub-empires, Grecian sub-empires, doing their thing over that period of time, right? And it comes toward, it's focusing on the king of the north and south, so the Seleucids and the Ptolemaic. It's not really talking about the other ones right here, right? So for all those verses, it takes you up to verse 18. So it's talking about one of those two kings. I think it's the north here. It says, he turneth back his face to the isles and has captured many. And a prince has caused his reproach of himself to cease, and without his reproach he turneth back to him. And he turneth back to face the strongholds of his land, and he has stumbled and fallen and is not found. So this is like the fall of that key subject over the last 10 verses or so. This is where it changes. This is where it's no longer these remnant Grecian empires. It's now going over to the final beast kingdom, right? So in verse 20, it says, and stood upon his station. So it says station because the person coming in is not the next king in line. He's taking the station that king had, and that station was to rule over the Holy Land, right? So he, and stood upon his station, has one causing an exactor to pass over the honor of the kingdom. And I did a study on all the occurrences of the word kingdom in Daniel, right? To help to make sure that everything was verifying what I was saying, right? So this is one of the first, or the first mention of the word kingdom here in all these verses so far, okay, in chapter 11. And this is the first place where it's talking about the kingdom, right? And it says the Passover, the honor of the kingdom. And it says, so this is talking about Sherebaz, right? So Khosrau died, and it says, stood on his station as one causing an exactor to pass over the honor of the kingdom, right? That was passed over to Sherebaz. And it says, in a few days he is destroyed, and not in anger nor in battle. It's because he was at this wedding ceremony. Somebody threw a spear in the audience, but it ended up impaling him and killing him. So he wasn't destroyed in anger or in battle. He was destroyed by an accident at a wedding ceremony when everybody was having a good time, right? And then it says, right? So that occurred around 630 AD. Now, Islam came in and conquered just after that. Now, Sherebaz's son actually turned out to convert to Christianity, and he helped fight against the Islamic invasion when it occurred. So Sherebaz's son doesn't count as a bad one, right? And God and Daniel would have Daniel would have known this because God would have known this. But nonetheless, so that's why it doesn't need to mention Sherebaz's son. But it's very interesting that it's literally, it matches up with what happened in history, right? So, and then it's from there and stood upon his station as a despicable one. Now, it's at this time in history that, and I don't want to get too deep into this for now, but the one who started the final beast kingdom religion, that he had risen up to power, and they had been conquering, doing raids of caravans and this and that there, and accumulating wealth, and they were probably taking people too and making them serve them as troops. So they're mounting. They started off with one person. He convinced others. He had a small following, and then they gained popularity by. They didn't gain too much popularity by doing teachings. Everybody pretty much turned them away. They tried to go to Christians and to Jews and to everybody. Everybody pretty much rejected them overall. So at the end of the day, if you read history, what they ended up doing was doing raids on caravans, amassing wealth, forcing small cities that were weaker to convert to their religion. And in doing so, they gained converts and they gained forces and wealth and power and all of that. And they became a very dominating force. But then suddenly their founder, died. I won't get too deep into that, but he passed away. It's believed to possibly have been poisoning. You can even read that on Wikipedia. But nobody knows for sure what it may have been. But nonetheless, he passed away. After he passed away, his his colleagues essentially were scrambling to maintain the empire that they're starting to build. So in doing so, they formed the caliphate. So with the founder gone, they then had a list of kings, or caliphs as they called it. Okay, and then the 10th caliph is the one who built the Dome of the Rock. But the first caliph came in and conquered Israel and all of that, and that was in 639, 640. So when Sherebaz died, I can't remember exactly what year it was. It was like around 630 AD. Then it went to his son for a short period, but his son ended up being pretty good in converting to Christianity. And then from there was another king who came in, either Byzantine or something. It might have been Heraclius or something. But there's another short period of few years with these disputes. But then came the invasion of Islam in 639 or so. And then they just outright conquered. I think the founder passed away in the early 630s AD. So it was around that time they started to form the caliphate, and it was the first caliph who came in and conquered. Okay, so those are the things that were transpiring at this point. So Sherebaz essentially took the kingdom away from Khosrau, and then after Khosrau died, Sherebaz had that, but he only ruled for a short period of time, and he died from that spear. Then his son went on, became a Christian, converted to Christianity, and actually served the right side. And then there was that short period of dispute. So that's the period of history before the invasion and conquering in 639. Okay, but what I also didn't know was something deeper, which was when the Crusaders came over, the timing of those things and what they did. So one of the times where they came over in the Crusades was around 1100. Okay, and what they did was, I didn't know, they established something called the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and they actually appointed kings over it. So whereas the Dome of the Rock had been built at that point for a few hundred years, and it was, an Islamic building with all of its inscriptions on the inside that rebuke Jesus, and all these things that are against what the Bible says that we should follow. They came in and basically decommissioned it and recommissioned it as a Christian structure. So in doing so, that's kind of like cleansing the holy place, because the holy place is the biblical term for the Temple Mount. So I had been looking for 2300 and 1150 to match with any type of event in history, and I couldn't find it. It was very hard to even find this out. But once I found it out and knew the key terms, like I didn't know there was a Kingdom of Jerusalem. That's what it was called. I knew about the Crusades, but I didn't know what specific years they took place. And I knew it was around 1100, 1200, right? But anyways, so they came in and formed the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They actually conquered it. They conquered Jerusalem, and they ruled it for a few hundred years. All right, you can read all about that. That's in history. When they conquered it, they rededicated the Dome of the Rock to be a Christian temple. Okay, and it was in the year 1140 or 1141. You can read this in history, right? It was dedicated as an abbey, so to function as a church. So that only puts it 29 years off of the numerical date that we were looking for, right? 1150 years after 29 AD. Should take us to 1179. However, they were still ruling with this Kingdom of Jerusalem until 1187. In 1187, Saladin came in of the Islamic Empire and reconquered Jerusalem again, but that didn't last too long. I think it was a couple hundred years at the most, but then they had another crusade come in and they recaptured it. However, the Kingdom of Jerusalem didn't stop existing when Saladin conquered. They moved their capital somewhere else, and they weren't defeated, but he conquered the land. So that's the history. But if we're looking for the 1150 afterwards, like I said, we find those events. At that period of time, Jerusalem had been reconquered and dedicated to the Messiah, okay, to Christianity. The Dome of the Rock, which was the abomination on the Temple Mount, had been conquered and rededicated to the Messiah, to God, right? But to the Messiah. So that is like a cleansing of the temple. If you think about it, you had all that period of time where it had been an abomination and tread upon and all this and that there. And then suddenly, now they did a lot of bad stuff. Like when the Crusaders came in, they did like a genocide. That is not commendable. I do not commend that. They were also Catholic. I also don't commend that theology. But at the end of the day, right, without picking straws over things, well, I'm just going to say, like I said, I don't commend those things. But at the end of the day, everybody on both sides is doing terrible stuff like that. That's just how life was lived back then. I think the way they did it was quite atrocious. I think they slaughtered like 70,000 people when they came in. It was probably most likely unnecessary. I don't think they were all fighting. You know what I mean? I think a lot of them are probably innocents, but I don't know. I wasn't there. And anyways, it is what it is, right? But if you look in history, it was the Dome of the Rock all that time until this period of time. Even though it's only 29 years off, that 29-year period that it's off, they were still ruling there with the Kingdom of Jerusalem dedicated to the Messiah. So it's not that far off, you know what I mean? And we weren't there at the time. Like they might have actually done something in 1179, like properly dedicated it. Maybe they removed the Catholic influence or did something, you know what I mean? But it's still in the right time period. So this is why I said like this, like 95%, 97% confidently that this is a fulfillment of what it was. So in this little excerpt here about the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, it says, the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade lasted for 1 month and 8 days from 7th of June 1099 to 5th of July 1099. It was carried out by the Crusader army, which successfully captured Jerusalem from the Fatimid Caliphate and subsequently founded the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Having returned the city and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to Christian rule, the siege was the final major armed engagement of the First Crusade, which had been proclaimed in 1095 to recover the Holy Land for the Christians in the context of the Muslim conquest. It said, oh, yeah, that's pretty terrible. As the Crusaders secure control over the Temple Mount, revered as the site of the two destroyed Jewish temples, they also seized Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock and repurposed them as Christian shrines. So that's a one little excerpt I'll just read there. Let's see. They had a king of Jerusalem. I think these were Frankish peoples. They were Europeans, but nonetheless. Templum Domini. This was the name attributed by the Crusaders to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So once they had conquered, they rededicated the Dome of the Rock as Templum Domini, Temple of the Lord. It became an important symbol of Jerusalem, depicted on coins minted under the Catholic Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem. It says a little bit of history here. The Dome of the Rock was erected in the late 7th century under the 5th Umayyad Caliph. Can't pronounce his name, sorry, at the site of the former Second Jewish Temple. After the capture of Jerusalem in the First Crusade, the Dome of the Rock was given into the care of Augustinian canons regular. At first, the rock around which the shrine had been built was left uncovered and the canons placed an altar on it. Later, the rock was covered with white marble and an altar choir constructed upon it, a work that was likely completed only in 1140. This is getting closer to 1179, which is the target date for the 1150, right? In 1138, the Templum Domini was raised to the status of an abbey, and on 1st of April 1141, the church was dedicated solemnly to the papal legate Alberic of Ostia, possibly to St. Mary. The adjacent Al-Aqsa Mosque was called Templum Solomonus, Temple of Solomon, by the Crusaders. It first became a royal palace. The image of the dome as representing the Temple of Solomon became an important iconographic, for some reason I can't say that word now, iconographic element of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The royal seals of the kings of Jerusalem depicted the city symbolically, combining the Tower of David, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Dome of the Rock, and the city walls. They also rebuilt portions of it. After the completion of the purpose-built royal palace near the Jaffa Gate and to the south of the Tower of David, the King of Jerusalem gave the building to the Catholic monastery military order, the Knights Templar, who maintained it as their headquarters. The dome was indicated on the reverse of the seals of the Grand Masters of the Knights Templar and is possibly the architectural model for round Templar churches across Europe. Although, and the adjacent Dome of the Ascension was constructed as a baptistry during the Crusader period, but it since remained in the hands of Islamic authorities as a part of the larger complex of the Dome of the Rock. It turned back into a mosque after the Crusaders. So if we go read Daniel chapter 8 very quickly, we can see all this history taking place. So in verse 8, it says, "And the young he-goat, which is Alexander, has exerted itself very much, and when it's strong broken has been the great horn." This is around 300 and something BC, roughly, right? So that's when Alexander died, breaking of the great horn. And come up does a vision of four in its place at the four winds of the heavens. So this is the four empires: Ptolemaic, Egypt, Seleucid, Roman, and Sassanid, right? And then you have the Roman could have been west, Sassanid could have been east, right? There you go. Seleucid would have been north, Ptolemaic Egypt would have been south. However it works out, it doesn't make a difference because all these empires historically came about after King Alexander fell, like I said before. And then in verse 9, and then from one of them has come forth a little horn. So it doesn't specify which one, but it says from one of them. So in my opinion, this would have been from Rome, okay? So from Rome, under through being the Hasmonean Herodians, right? One of them came forth a little horn, and it exerteth itself greatly towards the south and towards the east and towards the beauteous land. This makes sense because the Hasmoneans ruled all of Israel at that time, right? The beauteous land represents Israel as well. And the Roman Empire at the time ruled everything around it. And it says, "Yea, it exerteth unto the host of the heavens." And now you tell me, what human king has ever exerted himself against the angels? You know what I mean? Who's ever done that? Nobody's ever done that. Even Pharaoh didn't get to do that. When the angels came down to Pharaoh, he didn't fight them or anything like that there. But the Herods did oppose Jesus. who's the prince of the host, the prince of princes, and all that. But it says, yea, it exerteth unto the host of the heavens, and causeth the fall to the earth of the host and of the stars, and trampleth them down. And unto the prince of the host it exerteth itself, and by it taken away has been the continual sacrifice. So unto the prince of the host it exerteth itself. Now you could imagine like any other Roman king or Greek king or whoever else, you could imagine somebody doing that. The only king who actually did exert himself against the prince of the host, who is Jesus, was the Herods. They're the only ones who did it, like I said. So this has to be talking about the Herodian king, right? So unto the prince of the host that exerteth itself, and by it taken away has been the continual sacrifice, and thrown down the base of his sanctuary. So the sanctuary was in the temple. The temple was thrown down shortly after the death of Jesus, just like Daniel and Jesus foretold. Okay? So this was taking place during that period of time under the Herodian kings. And it says, and the host is given up with the continual sacrifice through transgression. So once the temple is destroyed, they can't do the continual sacrifice anymore. Okay, and also after Jesus died, Jewish literature of the time records that there were omens from God for the next 40 years until the fall of the temple. Not that they believed Jesus was Messiah, they just believed that God gave them 40 years of warnings before the fall of the temple, right? But for 40 years, the continual flame refused to stay lit. Now, that's not necessarily the continual sacrifice, but it doesn't say the word sacrifice in the verse. It just says continual. It could be continual anything. Most people understand it to be continual sacrifice, most scholars anyways. But the continual flame is also like a continual sacrifice as well. And that was meant to continually stay lit. But that was one of the omens. It couldn't stay lit for those 40 years. So anyways, but also the sacrifices, the carnal sacrifices were stopped because there was no more temple. And also Jesus put an end to the sacrifices legally. So when you combine all of this together, the continual sacrifice was stopped around the time between when Jesus died and shortly and until the fall of the temple. Yeah, those different elements of it going into effect. All right, but it says the host is given up, those are the angels, with the continual sacrifice through transgression, and it throweth down truth to the earth that has worked and prospered. And then I hear a certain holy one speaking, and a certain holy one say to the wonderful number who is speaking, till when is the vision of the continual sacrifice, which you just mentioned, and of the transgression and astonishment to make both sanctuary and a host the treading down? And he saith to me, till evening, morning, 2,300, then is the holy place declared right. Remember, this is the English rendering, right? The original translation is worded a bit different, but I've already checked all this stuff, right? So then lower down, it continues on this around verse 21. So in verse 21, it talks about the same thing again. It says, the young he-goat, the hairy one, is the king of Javan, which is Greece, and the great horn that is between its eyes is the first king, who is Alexander. And that being broken, stand up to four in its place. Four kingdoms from the nation do stand up, and not in its own power. Like I said, Ptolemaic, Egypt, Seleucid, Roman, and Sassanid. Right? And in the latter end of their kingdom, talking about in the latter end of the Grecian kingdom, so in the latter end of these four sub-empires, that means that the latter end of the Sassanid kingdom, before I get ahead of myself, at the latter end of their kingdom, about the perfecting of, ignore the Sassanid comment there, in the latter end of their kingdom, about the perfecting of the transgressor, stand up as a king, fierce faced and understanding hidden things. This would have been the Herods, right? And his power has been mighty, and not by his own power. And wonderful things he destroyeth, and he has prospered and wrought and destroyed mighty ones and the people of the holy ones. And by his understanding also he has caused deceit prosper in his hand, and in his heart he exerteth himself like the Herods did. And by ease he destroyeth many, and against the prince of princes he standeth. So again, it's talking about the same one figure who opposed the prince of the host, the prince of princes. That was the Herods. And without hand he is broken. And the Herod, whichever one it was, classically died after exalting himself on the throne by an invisible stroke, right? And the appearance of the evening and the morning that is told is true, and thou hide thou the vision, for it is after many days, right? So that's the mention of the 2,300. That's the mention of those kings. And if we go read chapter 9 very quickly, in chapter 9, verse where is it? Starting in verse 25, and thou dost know that, and dost consider wisely from the going forth of the word to restore and to build Jerusalem till Messiah the leader is 7 weeks, in 60 and 2 weeks, that's 69 weeks, 483 years. The broad place has been built again, and the rampart even in the distress of times. So Jerusalem, both street and wall. The Bible says when that decree was given, it was given by Artaxerxes. History confirms that it was 457 BC. 483 years forwards gives you 26 AD for Messiah dies. So in verse 26, and after the 16 2 weeks plus the 7 that it just mentioned, after the 69, cut off his Messiah, in the city and the holy place are not his. That's 26 AD. The leader who has come does destroy the people. That was like Caligula or one of them who was coming afterwards. Whoever it was who came in and was it Titus and overthrew the temple and everything. But all those rulers after that point there came in and opposed Christians, fed them to lions. I mean, they were all pretty bad after that point, right? But the leader, it could just be representing the Roman leaders, the evil Roman leaders, right? But the leader who has come in does destroy the people, and its end is with a flood. Until the end is war, determined our desolations. So it's talking about the downfall of Israel. Desolations means the land has been made desolate. And he has strengthened a covenant with many 1 week, and in the midst of the week he caused the sacrifice and present to cease. Now, I've argued before, this is one of two figures. It's either talking about Messiah or it's talking about the Romans who came in. The Romans are already ruled, right? But the evil ones who came in and overthrew it. One of the two. Now, we know Jesus put an end to the sacrifices, and Jesus strengthened the covenant with us. So I think it's fair to say that it's actually talking about Jesus. You only got two subjects to choose from. The Romans never made a covenant with many. Okay. And yeah, some of the Romans, lots of the Roman rulers, lots of the Greek rulers, lots of the Babylonian and Persian rulers ended sacrifices and messed up temple ceremonies and operations. You take your pick. Even Alexander did that. Antiochus did that. Caligula did that. I mean, all the people did that. It's just ridiculous how many people did that. So you could just take your pick. But at the end of the day, we know Jesus did that. So Jesus died 26 AD. In the midst of the week would be 3.5 years later. So in around 29 AD, the sacrifice was taken away. So whoever did it, the point is that it happened in this short time period here. Within 7 years is when you're supposed to take the measure according to Daniel. It's got the same terms, talking about causing the sacrifice and present to cease, okay, as we saw in chapter 8, where you take away the continual sacrifice. So that's pinning it down to the Herodian kings who caused all this, that period of the Herodian kings. So if you take from 29 AD plus 1150 forward, you get to 1179, like I said. Now, the interesting thing is, remember what I was saying about the Crusaders coming and taking over Jerusalem, conquering it, rededicating the Dome of the Rock and all of that there. If we go and look in Daniel chapter 11 again, once it starts talking about the rise of the final beast kingdom, lower down in verse 30, it's talking. So the interesting thing, like I said before, is Daniel's talking about huge portions of history, over 2,600 years of time in his prophecies, right? That's a vast period of time. Where he talks about in chapter 11 at the start, the fall of Grecia, the sub-kingdoms afterwards for a little bit, that only takes you up to verse 19. Okay, so in terms of history, it talks about Grecia falling in verse 4, okay? And then that's where it splits into the sub-kingdoms, right? Seleucid, Ptolemaic, Roman, and Sassanid, right? And then it talks about them for only about 15 verses. And then in verse 20 is where it introduces the rise of the final beast kingdom, its founder, and how he establishes the final beast kingdom and rises to power, okay? It devotes the entire rest of the chapter, that is 25 verses. That is the most ever devoted by Daniel to any single figure. And for those 25 verses, it's only talking about that one person, okay, the one who created the final beast kingdom, okay? That's a tremendous amount of verses to be attributed to one person. So it's a very, very important person. It first introduces this person as the despicable one who has come in, okay? But the interesting thing is how, when you look at the history compared to from Daniel 11:20 onwards, it applies 100% to what that founder did when he rose to power. I mean, everything. It would take another half an hour or 45 minutes to go through all these verses to show that. But one thing I want to point out is how lower down in verse 30, it talks about how the Crusaders will come in and battle them, right? So here we see in verse 30, it says, and ships of Kittim, that's the Europeans from those regions, have come in against him, and he has been pained. Now, the pained could be representing the slaughter that the Crusaders did, right? So we know from history the Crusaders came from those European nations that were called Kittim. They came in on boats, which Kittim are famous for, coming in by boat. Okay, and they did but a terrible large slaughter. Okay, just wrong word used. Right? So ships of Kittim have come in against him and his forces, right? What he started, and he has been pained and has turned back and has been insolent towards the Holy Covenant. So if we're talking about that period in history where the Crusaders came in, they conquered Jerusalem, okay? They had to wait for Saladin to come in at 1187, about 87 years later, for him to come in and reconquer it back for Islam. But verse 30 would be talking about this. And ships of Kittim have come in against him. He has been pained and has turned back and has been insolent towards the Holy Covenant and has wrought and turned back. And he understandeth concerning those forsaking the Holy Covenant. So stop and look what it says, right? The ships of Kittim come in against him, and he has been pained and has turned back and has been insolent towards the Holy Covenant and has wrought and turned back, and he understandeth concerning those forsaking the Holy Covenant. And it's literally the Crusaders coming in, getting it, and then Saladin coming in and reconquering it for Islam, right? And then after that is where it mentions in verse 31 how strong ones, the caliphs, would out of the founder, would rise up and pollute the sanctuary and the stronghold and turn aside the continual sacrifice and appoint the desolating abomination, which would be the Dome of the Rock built in 688 on the Temple Mount, which is the holy place. Jesus specifies it's the holy place, where Jesus says, when you see the abomination built on the holy place, then you should flee to the mountains, right? So anyways, like I said, it would take 45 minutes to read out the rest of chapter 11 here, but we can clearly see that all of this was actually talked about by Daniel. So he didn't omit anything. He actually spoke about it. And it's very, very interesting. So I think that's what the 2300 days prophecy actually is. It's like those Bibles and Bible commentaries say that it's actually 1150. And we know the day year principle to apply in Ezekiel 4. So it's 1,150 years. Daniel himself says in more than one chapter where you're taking the measure from, it's from those kings who opposed the Messiah and got him put to death. Those are the Herodian kings. So it's in that time period. So you count forward 1150 from that time period. You get to this period when the Crusaders had come in and reconquered Jerusalem from Islam, okay, and rededicated the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. It's within 29 years, you mean? And it's still within the period of time that they had conquered it, the Crusaders for Jesus, right? So that fits. That's a fulfillment. That's not like outside the ballpark. That's a fulfillment right there. So if you ask me, I think I finally cracked it. A little few percent of me is like, man, let me look a little bit deeper, but 97% or so of me is like, yeah, this is pretty solid, right? So like I said, I tried looking harder for anything specific about like dedicating or cleansing the temple in 1179. But I couldn't find anything specific. The most recent time that was 1141, where they dedicated it as a church, right? But that's where it's within 28, 29 years. That's not that far off, right? But they were still ruling it, and it was still a church in 1179. And it still was for another like 8 or 9 years after that, till Saladin came in and conquered. So by all fairness, this fits. Okay, this fits. And maybe God just wanted to round it up to a nice little neat number, 2300. I don't know. I mean, he did give 1335 elsewhere and 1290 and in that elsewhere, but maybe God just wanted this one to be like 2300, and the 2300 instead of 28, what was it, 2980 or whatever it would be. He could have been more exact, but maybe in God's mind, when it was rededicated as a Catholic church or whatever it was, maybe in God's mind that wasn't the moment. Maybe in 1179 it was properly dedicated spiritually in some way or something. I don't know, right? But still it fits, right? So that's pretty interesting. It's a better opinion than anything else. I've got a Bible that says it represents the 3.5 years Antiochus ruled. I mean, that to me is just ridiculous. Antiochus was like from 175 BC when he did this. Jesus talking about the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, and all that. He's talking about it being a future event. Jesus was, in 20 something AD. And Jesus saying it hasn't happened yet. So Antiochus was about 200 years before Jesus. So if Antiochus had done all this stuff already, then Jesus would have said so. But Jesus said it hadn't happened yet. So it can't be Antiochus, right? That's just a quick, easy grab for anybody to see, because they hear that Antiochus put a statue in the temple and made them do pig sacrifices and stuff. But at the end of the day, a lot of the pagan rulers who came in over the lands over those thousands of years did the same type of thing. Almost all of them put statues in the Jewish temple and interrupted the sacrifices. So take your pick. You know what I mean? Nebuchadnezzar did it. All the other Babylonians did it. The Medes and Persians did it probably as well. Although some of them allowed the sacrifices, some of them undoubtedly interrupted. I mean, the Medes and Persians didn't worship the same biblical God. They worshiped Marduk of Babylon, for heaven's sake, as testified by the Cyrus cylinders, right, where it says that King Cyrus praises King Marduk of Babylon, the god Marduk. King Alexander did it. Antiochus did it. I think Titus did it too. With the Romans, lots of Romans did that. I think Titus even did that. A lot of Roman rulers came and put like a statue of Zeus in there or dedicated it to Zeus. So, take your pick. And then all the other empires that came in afterwards. There was a period of time where the Temple Mount before the dome was built was used as a trash heap, according to some ancient text, right? It was used for trash. Like all the locals would throw their trash on it. That's pretty crazy. So all sorts of stuff has taken place like this, right? But the most fitting, pertinent fulfillment is the one that talks about that vast period of time where the final beast kingdom ruled the earth. So there you go. Okay, so Daniel 8 is not talking about the final beast kingdom. It's not talking about the Antichrist. It's talking about the Herods. Daniel chapter 9 is talking about the Herods. It's not talking about the final 7 years at the end of days. It's talking about the 7 years that transpired after Jesus died. Common sense. Okay, Daniel chapter 11 is talking about the fall of Grecia and a little bit about, those other kingdoms like Rome and this and that there, Sassanids and Seleucids and Ptolemaic Egypt, for about 15 verses, but then it goes into 25 verses, the whole rest of the chapter until the end of that chapter, exclusively about the rise of the final beast kingdom with its founder. Okay, and then chapter 12 is where the visions have ended, and God is just explaining the numbers to Daniel. Okay, so that's the breakdown of it for everybody. But holy moly, an hour? Let me get going. This is ridiculous. All right, take care. God bless.